resurrection. A bit like New Life or Storrington, your church is no more than about 30 people. But it's not a small church. In fact, most of the churches are the same size or smaller in the empire. You're not a leader. Like many others in church, you have a day job in trading that takes up most of your time. But the church is a big part of your life. You meet regularly with them throughout the week, and you love them dearly. It's not a rich church. Almost everyone in your church lives in a house that has just one room that the whole family meet in. But the church can meet all together regularly because of the wealthiest member of the church, a man named Diotrephes. Unlike the rest of the church, this man owns a large house with various rooms. In the center of his dwelling is a large atrium, that's an open space, and with the living quarters and various other rooms surrounding it. And that rectangular atrium in the middle of the building is just big enough to house the entire church all together. If it weren't for Diotrephes, the church wouldn't be able to meet together. Zoom wouldn't be invented for almost another 2,000 years. But you're not sure what you think about Diotrephes. You've heard that the Apostle John recently wrote a letter from Ephesus, but it mysteriously disappeared, and Diotrephes has been acting suspiciously. You have reason to think that he may have destroyed it. And you'd heard that some of the brothers working closely with the apostles had recently visited. They were due to visit last month, and you weren't sure who it would be, Titus, Timothy, Barnabas. Whoever it was though, you were excited to meet them, to hear them preach a word of encouragement. Your friend Justus and his family had even made space in their house to host this brother, whoever he may have been. But Diotrephes had told Justus's wife to cancel their plans. And no explanation was given, that the brother would not be coming anymore. Many in the church today, including you, are thankful for Diotrephes, thankful for his willingness to provide a space in his home where the whole church can meet together as one. But Diotrephes isn't a leader in the church. He doesn't have any special authority. So why is he acting in this way? It troubles you, but you fear speaking up. Diotrephes has close friends in the church, and you don't want to risk losing the venue the church depends upon. Maybe you should speak to Gaius. Like you, he's also very keen to welcome the visiting brothers, at least judging by the way he put them up last time a few months back. What a treatment that they received from good old Gaius. You almost wish that you were one of the visiting brothers. But it's not as if Gaius hasn't also been very kind to you in the past. It's just that since these brothers were complete strangers to the whole church, including to Gaius, you couldn't believe how generous he'd been in receiving them and how he'd welcomed them. So this is the situation in 3 John. I hope that you can kind of picture what it might have been like to be in Gaius's church. Some of what I've said is a bit of guesswork. We don't know whether Diotrephes was the wealthiest man in the church and he was providing the space for where the whole church met. He may have just been a very strong personality or influential person. But in verses 9 to 10, we see his influence, his ability to intercept John's previous letter, and his refusing entry to certain members of the church. So he could well have been the financial linchpin that the whole church depended upon to meet together. Who is Gaius? Did he have any formal position of leadership? It's not entirely clear. He may have been a leader or the leader. That may be why John chose to write to him in the first place, rather than risk writing another letter that's generally to the whole church and it being intercepted by Diotrephes. But he could have just been a close friend of John's, or someone who came to faith through him. In verse 4, he calls him one of his children. So take the picture that I painted with a pinch of salt, but I don't think it's too far off to how it may well have been in Gaius's church. How does Gaius's church, as described in 3 John, compare with the UK churches today? Well, the believers that John refers to were probably associates of the apostles, people like Titus, Barnabas, Epaphroditus, Timothy. John describes them as, in verse 7, as people who went out for the sake of the name. In other words, people who went out for Jesus' sake, people who were doing gospel work. And these brothers would have gone around visiting churches to speak about Jesus, basically, to speak publicly to the whole church in their meetings, but also privately in people's homes, to encourage them, to teach them, to train them, to report their progress in the faith to the apostles, people like Paul and Peter and John. And today in the churches, we also have visiting speakers, don't we? They're not associates of the apostles, but they visit local churches to preach. They participate in some of church life to encourage, to teach, and to train members of the congregation. Just think of John Woods, who spoke last week and has been training preachers in the church behind the scenes. And as in Gaius' day, these visiting speakers, these gospel workers, depend on the provision of the churches to do their work. In order to give them the time that they do to the work that they do, they're often involved in it full time. All their financial backing comes from believers giving to make it possible. I say believers because, as a matter of principle, these gospel workers wouldn't receive the money and support from unbelievers, as we see in verse 7. No, the gospel is supposed to be a free message. We don't want to leave any room for people to think they can buy their salvation, or that gospel workers are just offering empty clever talk for a bit of fast cash. As in Gaius' day, UK churches today also have visiting speakers or gospel workers doing the rounds. And as in Gaius' day, these gospel workers depend on the members of the church to provide some kind of financial backing for them, some support to them. How else do UK churches compare with those of Gaius' day? Well, there's no doubt that some in the church today have a spirit of Diotrephes. They throw their weight around and seek to make much of themselves. John says that Diotrephes loves to be first in verse 9. And in many churches, there are those who love to be the center of attention, who act with authority they don't have, who try to sway the whole congregation to fall in behind them, who perhaps do provide much of the financial backing of the church and use that fact to their own advantage. Or worse still, we have people who are actually the leaders of the churches, who make the ministry all about themselves. Perhaps we don't see the same level of control that Diotrephes had in excluding certain members of the church. But that spirit of Diotrephes can still be present in someone's intentional absence at a church meeting because of a person speaking, or their apathetic approach to the message being shared, or the person using their influence and connections to ensure certain speakers aren't invited in the first place. And surely there are also people in churches today like Gaius, who love the truth, who hunger for the teaching that's faithful to Jesus. John describes Gaius as a man who walks in accordance with the truth, in verse 3, and whose doctrines and beliefs are sound. Someone trying to get in. Yeah, someone whose doctrines and beliefs are sound. This is according to the visiting brothers in verse 3. There are people today, like in Gaius' day, who live out the truth, who willingly bear the cost of following Jesus. That's what we see Gaius doing here. Though the visiting brothers were strangers, according to John, Gaius had expressed a great deal of love in the way that he welcomed these visiting brothers, unlike Diotrephes, who refused to welcome them. Gaius embraced personal sacrifice for the good of others, following Jesus' example. He was a man who walked in truth and love. And there are certainly people like that today in the church. But why did John write this letter to Gaius? And what does it have to say to us today? I think this letter is ultimately an expression of John's desire to encourage Gaius. He's in a tricky situation. Though he's generally doing very well and John is very happy with his faithfulness, I think John feels it necessary to affirm him in his commitment to the truth and a desire to love the visiting brothers. Think of a tough situation you've faced recently. Imagine getting a call from someone who's close to you, who you look up to, who you respect. And they basically say, I know what you're going through. I know it's tough. But keep going. Don't give up. Well done for what you're doing. I'll be with you shortly to put things right. That's kind of the long and short of this letter from John. And it would have been really encouraging for Gaius to receive it. There's much we can learn from this letter, and Julian will be preaching from it next week with a slightly different angle. But the principles I want us to look at today, and I believe God desires to share through me with you, is about how we support gospel work, specifically in the context of how we how we receive gospel workers and how we send them well. I wonder if it's a question you've ever thought about, how we receive gospel workers well. Think back to the last few visiting speakers we've had in New Life. Last week we had John Woods visit us. Last year we had my brother-in-law Shane visit us and speak, and Claude from America speak too. I know at Storrington you guys have a lot of visitors all the time. If any of these people who visit us were to report what kind of reception they received in New Life and Storrington to others, what would they say about how they were treated by the church, about how they're treated by individuals in the church? In verse 5, John writes about how Gaius received others. Dear friend, you're faithful in what you're doing for the brothers and sisters, even though they are strangers to you. They have told the church about your love. The point to notice here is that what these brothers say about Gaius is about how they received the brothers. They noticed their love for them. Even though they were strangers, they weren't treated as the world typically treats strangers. No, Gaius had received them in a manner that honors God, expressing the love and generosity that knowing God's love inspires in us. Gaius was hospitable. He probably provided them a place to stay, provided food and water. He would have took an interest in their lives and their ministry, introduced them to other members of the church. When John says in verse 8, we ought therefore to show hospitality to such people, so that we may work together for the truth. The word for show hospitality can also be translated support. It's best to think of this as a kind of holding someone up, making them feel at ease. The way Gaius received the visiting brothers would have made them feel completely relaxed. They wouldn't have, as relaxed as they could be anyway, they wouldn't have had to worry about where the next meal was going to come from, or where they were going to sleep that night, or what they do between activities. No, because of Gaius' love, these brothers would have had the freedom to commit themselves fully to the work that they're involved in. Again, think back to those times we've had visiting gospel workers. Have we received them in a manner worthy of God, like Gaius? Expressing the generosity and love, costly love, that God has shown us in Jesus. Has our reception been close to Gaius's, or to that of Diotrephes, who wouldn't even allow the visiting brothers to come? What might receiving gospel workers well today look like? Well, some things don't change that much today. Like Gaius, we too might consider offering them breakfast, lunch and dinner, or asking children to share for a while, offering them a spare room in our house, or asking children to share for a while so that they can have a place to stay while they're with us. Obviously, circumstances vary. It might be more suitable to pay for their hotel room and their bus fare. Teaching and training content takes many hours of hard work to prepare, most of which is normally done before the gospel worker even arrives. How can those hours of hard work be compensated for generously? The question is about how we welcome the person with love, seeking to fulfill their needs and to go above and beyond, i.e. in a manner worthy of God, generously. In doing so, we work together for the truth, promoting and enabling the gospel work that the person is doing to continue. That maybe that gospel workers can visit churches, do their bit, and receive little financial welcome or support from the church. But if that becomes the norm, then the work just could not continue. It would not be sustainable, would it? How could the gospel worker afford to live? And where else are they to look for financial backing but the church? So in the interest of supporting gospel work, that the church might be built up, that the lost might be saved, it's important we receive gospel workers well. Doing so both honours God and honours the worker for all the hard work they're doing. In verse 6, John writes, please send them on their way in a manner that honours God. So we've looked at receiving gospel workers. Now we're going to consider how we might send them well. It may be that Gaius had sent these brothers well, that he had done a good job. And John just wanted to encourage him in that, to continue to do that for future visitors. but I think it reads more as an instruction, both in the NIV and other translations as well. Gaius had clearly done a great job in receiving the brothers, but perhaps he neglected to send them off properly. John doesn't write to condemn him, though. No, we remember it's a letter of encouragement. The desire to bless these brothers was clearly there, but perhaps Gaius hadn't really considered what sending them off well might look like. Perhaps we too might do the same. It's all very well providing for the needs of the gospel worker while they're with us. It's all very well being generous while we receive their teaching and training. It's all very well compensating them for all that they've done before they even arrived. But what about when they leave? They'll have travel expenses, living expenses between ministry, future churches that they may visit who may never have considered how to support gospel work well. Would a one-off financial gift be of use to them in their ministry? How much would cover their costs? How much extra could we give to give generously and support them, to multiply the work and honour the worker? Can we alleviate the upcoming expenses by paying for something for them? Would a leaving gift be of use to them in their downtime to honour them? The point I'm trying to make here is that we consider how to support gospel workers and their ministry generously as we send them off too. Our desire should be to work together for the truth, as John writes in verse 8. The truth that Jesus is Lord, the truth that the gospel is a saving message people need to hear, the truth that is Jesus himself. Working together for the truth is essentially about working together for Jesus, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No matter how generous we are while they're with us, no matter how much we might verbally approve all that they're doing, isn't it a bit hollow if we leave them empty-handed when it's time to say goodbye? Of course, good stewardship of resources is essential. We can only give in accordance with what we have. But the general principle of honouring God is paramount. We must ask ourselves if we're being mean with a spirit of Diotrephes. In the words of 2 John, we must ask ourselves if we're walking in truth and love. Because as we support gospel workers, we will be supporting gospel work. How we support or fail to support gospel workers may well reflect how much we really care about the coming of God's kingdom everywhere, not just in our church and our lives. As we close, I want you to consider who you think you most resonate with, Gaius or Diotrephes. If you're a bit like me and there's a bit too much Diotrephes in you, what are you going to do about it? How might you need to change the way you think about and approach supporting gospel work? Do you need to rethink how you receive and benefit from gospel workers online? Maybe there's an online ministry that you've benefited from for years, but never really considered your part in supporting it. And what about us as a church? Do we need to ask ourselves some hard questions about how we support gospel workers, how we support gospel work through our support of gospel workers? I hope you'll agree with me that it's a conversation worth having, a question worth asking. There's much to be discussed and some tough practical questions I haven't even touched on. Should a married gospel worker be paid more if his or her spouse is a full-time parent or carer? Should the church use money from general funds to support a gospel worker that's visiting, or should it come from some offering of some sort, or a mixture of both? How does the amount we give accommodate for the qualifications of a visiting gospel worker, which may have required many hours of hard work and money? There's no time to answer these now. Let us just remember the principle of generosity, because in Jesus, we have the supreme example of self-giving kindness. Once we were God's enemies, opposed to God's leading, going our own way. But despite that, being rich in love, God gave up his one and only Son. He paid the highest price that we might know him and enjoy him forever. How do our lives reflect a right response to that generosity that God has shown us in Christ? Let's pray.